Well, it is my pleasure to welcome everybody to today's webinar presentation on Beyond Succession Planning, Navigating Generational Transition Challenges and Changes. I'm so pleased to have our panelists with us today. We're going to talk about their backgrounds a little bit and as we get going. Before we do, I want to share a couple of ways for you to participate, get the most out of our time together. All of your functions, for those of you who are familiar with Zoom, are available via the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We will take questions throughout the program using the Q&A panel in the Zoom interface. So again, you can put those in at any time. We have time reserved at the end of our conversation to cover those. We may pick a few of those along the way as to keep our conversation moving. And we also have a post survey that will launch directly after the program. We really look forward to your feedback on that. We do use your feedback to design future programs. So if you're willing to take a few minutes just to give us your thoughts, that is very helpful to us. It's also a way to open a conversation with Josh or Jen or the team in any way afterwards if you have additional questions or would like to follow up. So look out for that. Also, today's presentation is being recorded and will be provided within 48 hours. We'll also send you by email some additional resources, some articles and additional references that you might consider on the topic if you're looking to learn more. You should know also that we value confidentiality. A lot of things we talk about are based on real family situations, but we are going to sanitize those or amalgamize those so that we can share what is common and real in family situations without divulging things that are specific to any family. Any of the questions that you ask during the program, we're not going to identify you by name either. So we'll just respond to the question. You don't have to feel worried about your identity with those questions. We want to make this a dialogue, so feel free to contribute in that way. And also, this is an educational dialogue. So we're going to talk about practices, ideas, experiences today. Your family situation may be very different. And so we encourage you to consult with your own advisors before putting any plans into place for your own family. And with that, it's my honor to introduce my colleagues who are your subject matter experts for the day. First with us is Joshua Nacht. Josh is based in Colorado, and Jennifer Strom is with us as well, based in Connecticut. Both of them work with a wide variety of families on the matters that we're going to talk about today around succession, continuity, governance, family dynamics, communication. So we're going to hit on a lot of very important themes. Josh and Jen, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks, Christy.
Thanks, Christy.
And my name is Christy Dada. It is my pleasure to be the moderator for today's program. So with that, we will get right into the conversation. Today's discussion is going to focus on the post-transition world for a family business. So when the family has placed a new business leader, possibly transitioned ownership or governance, many families are surprised by the challenges that crop up after the succession event is complete. So let's start by giving some perspective. Josh, maybe you can start us off. What do you find that families experience as they go through this transition?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the reasons we often get called, right? Is that families are going through, they're either anticipating a transition, they're going through one, or the transition has occurred and they're discovering, wow, this is a lot more difficult than we thought. Because I think one of the themes that you'll see in the conversation today is that these transitions are not an event. It truly is a process. And even though there may be a change in positionality for somebody, that what we want to really talk about is that there's a lot of pre-planning before that change occurs. And then afterwards, there's quite a bit of communication and dialogue that needs to happen to make sure that the transition goes smoothly and that you're managing all the difficulties that come up, because there are a lot of difficulties after the transition that families need to communicate about. And I think that one of the main things that we see is that there's a lot of work of coordinating and managing the expectations between generations. You know, I think we're going to talk about this a lot in the context of a family member stepping out and a family member stepping in. A lot of this is true when we're working with a non-family member transitioning into that position as well. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around managing the expectations, and that's particularly around roles and responsibilities. What were people's roles and responsibilities before, during, and after this type of transition. And this really focuses on, decisions and truly around power and authority and influence. Because what we see is that we may transition a position of power that comes with certain authority, that comes with certain decision-making rights. But clearly before and after, there's a lot of influence that those same people may have. And we want to get clear on this, because if there's a lack of clarity around the roles, the responsibilities, and how decisions are made, I think that's where there can be a lot of confusion and challenges. And I'm not pretending that this is super cut and dry and super duper clear. It's the sort of thing that we help families talk through and come to agreements on, and then manage the challenges of actually putting it in place. Because I think, as we can all see, it can be really challenging as an outgoing leader to just say, well, okay, now you make the decisions and you have all the power and the authority. Oftentimes those people need to have influence and need to be involved for some period of time so they can build trust. And the incoming leader can also learn, from the person who is an outgoing leader. There can be a real tendency to defer to the person who was in the position before. And that can lead to some confusion, especially among managers and employees. Well, who's really in charge here? You say it's the new person, but it sure feels like it's the old person. And that can have a real impact on all managers, not family and non-family managers.
Absolutely, Josh. So today's conversation, we want to focus heavily on the after of the succession and transition process. But we also know that how families approach succession and preparing for these transitions has a big impact on how smoothly things can go going forward. So Jen, why don't you share with us, what are some of the things that you see families do that help smooth the path for later steps of the transition?
Thanks, Christy. Well, Josh alluded to and introduced the idea of complexity, and that the way that through transition decisions are being made is different than how they were being made in the past. So when we approach with any family that we are working with the thoughts about transition, we're always wanting to do it from a place of intention. And so when we're looking at intention, we're looking at intention from a few different angles. The first of which applies to anything, if succession or otherwise, is communication. So if you're going to be shifting the way that you do anything, one important factor is the capacity to be able to communicate about it. So we want to have the right people in the right rooms at the right times to be able to have discussions about what to expect, what actually will be happening. So there will be times when people will disagree. Productive conflict is good conflict in our mind. We don't expect everybody to agree on everything at the right time. I mean, at every time, but what we want is productive conflict in which we can have conversations where people are hearing each other's perspectives and able to accept decisions about how they're going to move forward. So the second part of communication is also around transparency. So there can be tons of anxiety around change. So when we're looking at how things were working before and how they're going to work in the future, there could be anxiety on both sides. There can be anxiety on the side of an outgoing generation and anxiety on the side of incoming, who's going to be in roles and who's going to be outside of roles in the business and other places if we're talking about owner succession. So communication and doing it intentionally and creating forums is a huge part of that. The second part of it, Josh also started to introduce when he was talking about roles and responsibilities. So one of the things that we find when we're looking at transition and looking at the after succession piece is roles shift. So whereas one person may have been made, or multiple people may have been making decisions as owners, as board members, as the person running the company, as shareholders, as family members, really defining who's making what decisions as you go through that transition so that everybody can, if it's not determined, it can be determined that there are different roles for all of those things. And also to clarify if there are going to be different people making those decisions, how those roles are going to shift around. So that's, in our language, what we call governance, how decisions are being made and who are the people that sit at the table when those decisions are being made. So when we look at both the communication component and the intention around defining the who's doing what around governance, that helps create clarity that can make that transition past and through succession run so much more smoothly. So that intentionality to us is really the key.
Yeah, and I think a piece here that I've seen help families be successful is that they have a regular way to meet and talk about the transition itself. And that may be a separate and distinct meeting from some of their other business meetings, from even sometimes other governance meetings, that they set aside the time to have dedicated time to talk. How is the transition going? What's working? What's not working? And I think having a regular cadence on that can be really helpful. And that can involve much more than just the family members, right? You want to involve your management team, and people who can approach this from different angles and be really forthright about what's working, what's not working, and what do we need to adjust. And I find that regular cadence really helps families focus on the transition. And over time, they'll say, okay, maybe we can stretch this out a little bit. At the beginning, it might be every other week, maybe once a month. And over time, it can get stretched out as they get more comfortable.
In hearing what Josh was saying just now, I thought of an example that applies to how we're talking about intention, and then Josh talking about setting a cadence and how these things happen. So I was thinking about a client family in which there was going to be a transition from several G3 family members that had a rather complex enterprise because they were managing decisions around multiple businesses as well as real estate assets and some shared investments. And G3 had really done a fabulous job in running this enterprise over time and growing it. And with the transition to the next generation, there was a hesitancy in the communication piece, to share the decisions that were already in place. And there was a fear of talking about both the business succession and the ownership succession. So the communication piece came into play. So what we did was we created forums to start talking about all of these different pieces. So we were very intentional in setting out in our discussion about how to do this and doing it at a regular cadence. So the first piece was bringing G4 to the table to really understand the plans that were already in place for both business succession and ownership succession, to also have clarity around who was going to be in place and a comfort level that if you weren't at one table, that it's okay because you were at another table. So if you weren't going to be running the business, that perhaps you'd be a shareholder. If you weren't going to be a shareholder, perhaps you still had the opportunity to have a role on the board. So the idea that Josh was talking about in creating the right forums to understand succession is much more than about the decision of who's going to run which business and who's going to be on the board and who's going to own what percentage of shares. It was creating all of the right opportunities for everybody to talk about these things and be very clear in a decision-making matrix on who makes what decisions. By doing that, we took all the anxiety out of the system that G3 had about one, sharing information, and that they were going to create. It was a really beneficial anxiety. They didn't want anybody to be hurt that some people were going to be at some tables versus the others. But what they realized is that by having a cadence of conversation, they were really making everyone feel more comfortable with that transition, and that made their entire succession planning process run so smoothly in a really complex enterprise by doing exactly what Josh said and creating attention and meeting and communications and being very clear on roles and who does what. So what was a big anxiety producing experience up front became something that was really very easy once everyone started talking. So
I think what I've heard you guys talking about that really I want to connect as we go into the conversation, the intentionality and the awareness of the shifting of sort of power, authority, influence, all of those things, defining the roles and the cadence. That level of intentionality and awareness, absolutely great groundwork for going forward. when the rubber meets the road is where maybe sometimes, and that's, you know, the underlying thing that we want to talk about today is like when you put it into practice, it can look and feel different, and it can take a bit for people to get comfortable in those new models. So Josh, why don't you help us reflect on, you know, as you know, with family decision making in new structures, what do you see families struggle with when the rubber does hit the road, and how can families recognize that they're having challenges with this new decision making process and do something about it?
Yeah, I think it'll be pretty clear when families are having challenges because there's going to be a lot of confusion. Toes will get stepped on, and you know there can be some real hurt feelings. Like, wow, I'm in this new position, but I'm not really making decisions because everybody still goes to so and so. And I think that you know a piece here is that this is a team effort. You know, sometimes we look at a single position that's transitioning. But the reality is that when one thing changes, everything changes in the system. And that the more this is approached as a team effort, not a singular position transition, I think families tend to succeed because they approach it as such. And when they come together as a team to say, all right, let's establish a process on how we make decisions. And we call this FAIR process. And I really recommend doing this well before the transition. And this is kind of a matter of good management anyway, as a family enterprise, is saying, let's build some guidelines and some agreements on how we make decisions together. And where decisions are brought, who has input, who's informed. And basically what this means is that you're creating a decision matrix. And a decision matrix is not intended to be so prescriptive that you have every single little decision, right? Because then you create a phone book and it can be really cumbersome. But what we've seen, you know, I've helped a lot of families be successful creating a decision matrix that is specific enough that it gives really good guidelines, but it's also general enough that we're not trying to overdo it and we get bogged down in the details. And what the decision matrix does is it outlines key decisions, who has the ultimate authority over that decision, who is the final decision maker, who needs input on that decision. Because sometimes a lot of people need input onto something, even if they don't have a vote or they're making the final decision. Sometimes people need to be informed, like this is the process. Some families keep this simple, and some families actually frame this out, you know, to quite a good level of detail because that's what they need. Now, the next piece is putting that into use, right? Because where it can be a nice thing to have on paper, it only matters as families bring it into use and say, as these decisions come up and as these questions come up, let's make sure we're really clear here on who, you know, what the roles and responsibilities are around this decision, and they can refer back to that decision matrix. As time goes on, you may learn that, okay, we need it less because it starts to be part of the system, but I think particularly in the transition and afterwards, it really helps to have that framework because that gives everybody the same foundation about how they're approaching decisions. And you've also, you know, established your guidelines, your fair process guidelines around how the decision is made, meaning we need the information beforehand. Everybody at the table has a voice. We're not just going to let one or two voices dominate. Let's be clear, do we need more time on this decision? Or are we ready to make it now? Because people make decisions at different speeds. You know, I'm working with a board right now, and in speaking with the board about where they're good at communicating and not communicating, there's a real piece that half the group can make decisions pretty quickly. The information is there, they've got it, they've processed it, let's make a decision and move on. The other half of the group says, I need time. You know, I can't do it that quickly. I need either an overnight or I need to do it at the next meeting if you have that sort of time. And it's an interesting piece because there's not a split, but there's two different approaches, and it can be frustrating for each. When people feel like I'm being pushed into a decision, or geez, I don't have enough time to make the decision. So in this group, the work is being clear there's different approaches, and coming to agreements on when that decision is of some urgency and the decision needs to be made now, or at least in this meeting, and when we may have more time on it. And it's kind of the meta process of helping people see how they communicate and how they make decisions effectively. Part of that then speaks to relationships, right? You're getting to know each other better. And in that setting, it's an all-family board, but I think you can see how this applies to a management team or family governance as well. So all of this helps build accountability, because you're really helping each other see, all right, these are the agreements that we made around decision-making, and let's follow them. And one more example with a family who has a very well-established family council and a very well-established process for how they make decisions. And there's one family member who is kind of the voice that sometimes brings in things that other people don't want to hear. And that can be difficult at times. And he actually has some really valuable things to add, and will sometimes try to bring those topics up outside of the normal process. And that is really difficult for people, because it's what happens is that it feels like it's trying to circumnavigate the established process. And his voice and his valuable input doesn't always get to be integrated in the way it needs to. So the work here is saying, hey, we appreciate your perspective and we appreciate what you're bringing up. It needs to happen through this process. You need to bring those concerns to the family council. The family council needs to work through them so we understand, where are you coming from? What's your interest here? And then let's talk about that in the most effective way possible. And what we found is that the more we go back to that consistent process of it needs to come to the family council and we need to vet it, it builds trust that we are dealing with the decisions in the best way possible. And it helps everybody see these are the guidelines that we've created and we're going to follow them. So it builds trust in the system. It also builds accountability for this individual to make sure that they can't go to these other outlets. This is the way we do it here. And it's led to a much more effective process. And it's led to his input being considered, which is really important for everybody, because he has, his voice matters the same as everybody else's.
So Josh, you might kick me to the curb or to the side of the screen, but you're talking about decision-making matrix and how in that case, in a decision-making matrix, a family council will have certain decisions to make. So if I were to give you an example and to say, or pose a question, so you have a CEO who'd been making decisions in the past from one generation, and now we're beyond succession, and there was going to be somebody else making decisions, whether that's someone from the next generation or non-family CEO. And I just want to give an example of how a decision-making matrix would work. So what if one of the decisions that was going to be made was creating a strategy for the company? Can you explain how a decision-making matrix would help articulate the expectations around that if you were using an actual matrix?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example. And I think what you would look at is who has ultimate authority over that strategy. If there's a board of directors in place, the board may have the ultimate sign off on the strategy. Who is responsible for creating that strategy? Generally, the management team is responsible for creating the strategy. The board may have input on that. And, you want to be clear who has input on that. They're responsible for creating it. And then what is the voice of the owners in the strategy? Because if there's a strategy being created that's out of alignment with the ownership group, you're probably going to have a problem. And that's, whether that's a small, very connected ownership group, or we work with some families where there's 50 owners, so that alignment becomes that much more important. But ultimately, do the owners have the responsibility for creating and approving that strategy? Well, generally not. That's the job of the board of directors and the management team. So I think that having the decision matrix can bring clarity to this. And you want to establish this all, as much as possible in a neutral atmosphere, right? Because then it's easy to agree upon, it's easy for people to understand. Then when you get into the process, people can understand, okay, what is my place here? And it's that much easier if somebody tries to step outside that role or goes back to their old role, which can be really common. Everybody can say, hey, you know, Uncle John, we agreed on this process. We agreed this is how we would make the decision. And we want to follow that. And so it's not punitive. It's a way that you have agreements so everybody can work together as a team in the best way possible.
Perfect. And I think that that really gets at that beyond succession by setting that expectation up intentionally upfront. If we're doing it differently, how that can really help. So thanks.
Yeah, and I'd like to take a moment to take a couple of questions right now, because actually what I'm seeing is a connection to what you're sharing, Josh, as we think about the decision matrix. Oftentimes we talk about the who makes the decision, but we also may need to think about who's informed, who's consulted, like who has a voice in that process. And your example was a great call out for how do we give voice in the process if someone maybe doesn't have the decision authority. So we have a couple succession related questions that have to do with kind of how do we engage other stakeholders. One of the questions is, how do you announce a promotion of a family member to president without creating a negative dynamic with other family members who may have been seeking that role?
So it's a really good question. So I think this goes back to the very beginning when we were talking about communication. So the sooner that you get in people, and I know we're talking about beyond succession. Now I'm shifting to pre-succession, but there's a reason for that. So the sooner you get people engaged in conversation about succession, so that there is an expectation that you can't have multiple people in the same role and that multiple roles exist as family members, as owners, as board members, if a board exists, as leadership. The more educated that all of the stakeholders are upfront, the less contention there is around decisions ultimately. Another way to manage that is through exactly what we're talking about, is if I don't have a voice at this table. So if I'm not going to become the CEO, but Josh is, and we're in the same family, what is my voice? Where do I get to express concerns? How am I heard? Josh had talked about fair process, right? And a huge part of fair process is understanding not only what tables you sit at, but when you're sitting at those tables, how are decisions actually made? So how was the decision actually made to put that person in place? The other thing is parameters around that, right? Was there a clear path to succession? Did this person have certain types of experience? That is what we look for in order to herald and move the company forward. So the more conversation and communication, the better. Now, ultimately, family dynamics come into play. Sometimes there may be disagreements over it. And when it does, we'd be silly to say that we never have issues when that happened. We manage it. So again, we facilitate that conversation. The why is it frustrating? Are they concerned that their family won't be represented if somebody in their family isn't the person that's running the company? But then maybe we have a family counselor. Maybe we have a way for owners to be heard differently. And let's talk about the power in those groups so that maybe the concerns that are actually the concerns about someone else becoming the CEO, we hear them, but we say, realistically, the things you're worried about, you don't need to worry about, because there are these other tables that really are steering the direction that this person is ultimately having to carry out. So we don't ignore it, we address it. So when the problems do arise, if they arise, we address them then too. So there's some proactive, there's some during in process, and then there's some retroactive when there are repercussions. We talk through them and help educate and inform. And like Josh says, create a regular cadence of conversations that people have a voice in, so that they understand, okay, maybe I was reacting and I don't need to be worried about this. And if I want an opportunity in the future to either have this role or another, here's how I do that if it's about a specific role. So.
And you actually hit on an answer to another question that was in the queue, which had to do with, if you're going to go through a succession process, do you communicate that there will be a process and then later communicate who will be involved, or do you communicate that there was a process and what the decision is. And I think what I heard from you, and I'd love to hear you build on it a little bit more, is, getting people into the dialogue earlier is going to build the support and the engagement that you need going forward. But I welcome additional thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, our go-to will always be that more communication is better. Anxiety is created in any system when decisions are made in a box. Now, that doesn't mean that all information is shared with all groups at all times, but it does mean that we are very intentional about how information gets shared at the right time. And definitely when there's going to be a succession planning process specifically, the more that's communicated upfront so that there's clarity on how the decisions will be made. And as they're being made, there's transparency around how people were chosen, what's the process that we've gone through, why there's confidence in this person. And the more buy-in that you have in the beginning, the better. So decisions should never be made in a box. With that said, we don't share all information with everybody at all times, but we are specific about when information is shared, and the sooner the better, especially with succession planning. So I don't know if you have different thoughts about that, Josh, or anything to add.
Well, I think that I want to acknowledge that everything we're talking about is easy in concept and theory and is a lot more challenging when you get in the room and you're working with family dynamics and you're working with different generations and ages, and sometimes relationships and things that have been in place for years, if not decades, right? So what we're offering here is some tools and some ideas that can help give some structure to this process, which is, sort of beginning, middle, and the long tail of onboarding and everything that happens afterwards. And that it's truly work. And that if this was easy and we could just say, well, you do a decision matrix and you do fair process and you follow that and it's going to be okay, this would be a lot easier for everybody. The reality is that when you mix those family dynamics in, that's where it becomes really challenging. And so we are always managing how you interrelate as a family, because the family dynamics, the communication, the emotions are what makes this really difficult. And so there are different pieces of this where sometimes you'd say, well, okay, we have a great decision-making process, but we always butt heads because of this thing over here. Well, sometimes it's okay to take a time out and work with individuals or groups on a different family level to address some of those dynamics, to bring them out into the open and say, how are those dynamics holding you back from a successful transition? And these are not problems that are just solved. These are truly things to be managed over time and often need the help of a neutral facilitator and somebody to come in and say, here's what I see is happening. Your dynamics are getting in the way of this. Your relationships or lack of trust are creating real challenges. So let's work on that for a little bit. And that's why all of this does take time. Some families manage it quite well because they have high trust, relatively low conflict. And for other families, this can be a real power struggle. And you get a lot of family dynamics involved, particularly as we've seen, and I've seen with a number of clients, there can be some real power dynamics between branches, where you may be in second, third, fourth generation and families kind of have a branch mentality. And that there can be a real power dynamic that emerges that sometimes we have to shine light on, say, okay, what's going on here? And help people remember, this is kind of coming back to the team thing. You may think of yourselves in these different branches, and I understand why. How can you work as a team? And how can we say what is best for the business as a collective? What's best for the family as a collective group? And this is a piece of building consensus. And consensus means this is something we can all live with and move forward with. And part of the reason I bring this up is part of building consensus is often having a good process, a fair process to get there, where everybody does have input, everybody is heard, there's transparency around the decision, and everybody feels like, okay, this is fair. Maybe I didn't get my way or I didn't get all of my way, but it's something I can live with because this is the input of everybody who needs input on the matter. Easier said than done, but I think we've seen numerous families where we have slowed down the process, make sure that that input is there, and that families do emerge with something they say, yeah, I can move forward with that.
You know, I want to go back to something you said, Josh, when you started this, which I very much appreciate, which was you were talking about family dynamics, and then getting to how consensus and communication are important. But we can't really, and we always say we're talking about succession. We're talking about tools like decision-making matrices and fair process and things that in family councils and boards and things we can use. But we can't take the family out of family business. So the reality is this is a succession process, and we can use tools, but every family is different. So Josh talked about, there can be branch dynamics. There can be sibling dynamics. There can be, branch dynamics can mean cousin dynamics. Generations can see things differently. We're all people that have different personalities. So we can use every tool in the world, but if we are not cognizant of who the people in the family are and what they're bringing to the table, we're not going to get anywhere pre-succession or post-succession. So we need to have the capacity to have these conversations and to recognize the family dynamics and the people around us. There are so many emotions that are going into any decision, succession being the biggest transition that people go through, or one of them. So really paying attention to what are those the dynamics in the family, and giving them credence, paying attention to them. We do not ignore them and come in there with a decision-making matrix and say, these are the people and how we're going to be making decisions. If we did that, we would fail. The families we work with would fail. We need very much to understand the dynamics that exist, that are underlying the system, and that will make succession, beyond the succession, pre-succession, 5 years after, 10 years after, what's going to make this complicated? And we need to have those conversations too. So I very much appreciate that Josh brought up the family dynamics piece, because we talked a lot about structure and process and matrices and boards, but really what this comes down to is people. So we can put those structures in place, but it's a family, multiple families, usually, with the clients that we're working with, and we need to understand what those dynamics are. So we do not ignore them at all, and that makes the process successful.
Yeah, I appreciate that perspective, both of you. I think because the language we often use is succession plan, right? Which sounds like a set of bullets that we can execute on successfully, but it's lived through people. And what I've heard in today's conversation about having a cadence for discussing things is a structure for identifying when it seems important to both kind of look around corners. And in a moment, we'll move on to our next question, which is about looking around some additional corners that you might not have thought about yet in terms of your succession plan. But there's a bit about looking around corners, which is something I know that you all help families do, and good planning can help about thinking about, okay, what's the next thing we're going to have to tackle? And then there's a piece about giving a space for reflection and identifying things that just emerge as we go through this and making sure that they're addressed. So I think that kind of that both and there can be really helpful to families in thinking about how to deal with the dynamics as they emerge. So I appreciated that about your responses. As we go into the next section, Jen, I'm going to pose this one back to you because leadership succession may be the thing that triggers a transition conversation, but typically there may be multiple transitions that go on at the same time. So it could be just leadership succession, or it could be leadership and ownership. There might be board transition. If there's a formal family governance, like a family council, it may have its own transition process. And sometimes those things are related. They're happening near the same time because, a generational transition is afoot. And so there's multiple pieces at play. What are some additional specific issues that you see families needing to attend to after this kind of transition or through this transition that maybe they haven't considered before?
No, I think this ties in a lot of the things that we've touched on, which is one, creating the tables, creating the places that people are having these different conversations as owners, as leadership, as the board, as family, and creating a cadence, opening up communication. You know, as consultants, we work with entire systems. We're not working for one person in the system. So if we're talking about succession, we are not specifically addressing who's going to be sitting in the seat as CEO next. I mean, we are, but that's one big part of this. Like you said, there are often lots of pieces that are tied, that transitions that go on in families over time. So we find that really understanding the entire system, who's engaged, where are they going to be engaged, how can we create the right cadence around conversations, how can we create the right guidelines and policies so that we're setting people up for success. An example of that would be something like a board observer or board policy. So as we go into succession, if we're going to be creating a board or if it exists, how can we create guidelines so that people who aren't in that succession seat may be becoming owners someday, may or may not be working in the company, may be spouses. Are they able to have a role on the board? In order to have a role on the board, what are the processes or guidelines that we're going to create to get them there? So I guess a way, what I'm saying is that there are lots of landmines that can exist, and they exist when we're not making sure that we're representing the whole system, that we're thinking about all of the things that could come up for everybody involved, not just the people that are going to be running the company and not running the company, but where does everybody sit? What are the things that we need to talk about? How can we make things fair? Like Josh was saying, what's a fair process? Do we have a cadence of conversation where we're addressing these issues so that everybody feels that they're represented through these transitions, which, like you said, can happen in multiple places? We want to make sure we're opening it up to, and the other thing is we've had experience with many families, right? So we have an idea where landmines come about. You know, I just gave an example of one. If we don't create parameters for something like a board, and all of a sudden I'm putting my friend on the board. Well, if I could put my friend on the board, why can my cousin not put their friend on the board? And does that mean that my brother should be on the board? And so that will create conflict down the road. So we want to make sure that after a succession and in thinking about multiple transitions, that we use our experience in creating guidelines, and then the opportunity to talk about where everybody fits is only going to help avoid some of those landmines as we move forward. So.
Yeah, and I think a piece that makes all of this work and that we really have to factor in is trust, right? People have to trust each other in the system, and that's true for small entry-level positions all the way up, to the highest management and board positions. As a family team, you have to trust each other, and you have to trust in your non-family advisors, whether that is, family office, board, non-family managers, that none of this is going to work without trust. And so I think that's a mindset that we want to put in place here. A lot of what we're talking about with the agreements, the meetings, the ability to talk about this is transparency and accountability so that you're constantly building trust together. And I always say this, and when trust is damaged or bruised or something happens, the ability to build it back, to look at what happened and build it back. And a lot of the guidelines and the frameworks that we're talking about are ways to build, support, and sustain trust, and then to manage it when something does go sideways. And I know that can, again, be one of the most difficult elements. If there has not been trust, it's going to make this that much more difficult. You can build it as part of the process, but everybody involved needs to be responsible, accountable, and really stepping up to these guidelines that we've created. Otherwise, this process in itself won't build trust without people really engaging and investing in each other.
Perfect.
And the trust piece of this, a big part of what we do is understanding everybody's perspectives in the system. So decisions may have been made in the past that were made with really good intentions that don't fit the system now. Dynamics may exist with, between family members, or like I said, generations, or Josh had mentioned branches that we need to be able to reconcile. Expectations may have been had that people were going to come into roles that now are not. So we need to be able to talk about those things, like these are families, these are people, so that we can build trust going forward where everybody has the same expectations. And even if it's happening differently than it did in the past, it doesn't mean the way things were done in the past was wrong. It just means that as we expand and the size of the family expands, and there are people have their kids and their kids have their kids, guidelines are more important to maintain trust. So in order to do that, we have to be able to communicate and create guidelines, not because mistakes were made in the past or we can do it better or differently, just because it's important as things evolve, when we go through transitions, to be able to communicate differently. And that will only help foster the trust that Josh is referring to moving forward.
Thank you both. So I'm going to ask one last question before we go to some of the excellent questions that we have in the queue as well, which I'm going to pose to you, Josh. One of the most frequent questions from families that we see is how to appropriately engage the next generation who are stepping into new roles. So what are some of the roadblocks that you see to effectively engaging younger members of the family who are stepping up into various ways of leading and contributing, and how can families work through them?
Yeah, I think that one of the I'm going to try to frame this in a really positive way. The families that I see succeed in terms of engaging the next generation, and when I look at this, I'm thinking of people who are working in the enterprise or business, as well as those who may be owners who may be not working in the business, right? Who still play an important role. And the families that I see this do particularly well engage that next generation by bringing them into the process early. That I remember sitting in a meeting of, the G3s, and they had a whole meeting around how they wanted to engage the next generation. They came up with all these great ideas and they were going to do these things. And, I brought up, well, where is their voice in this process? You, as an older generation, are talking about what you want to do to engage the next generation, and they're not here. And how would it be to reach out to them to see what works for them and bring them into the fold? And this is where I've really started to work with families to shift that mindset that engagement of the next generation is not a top-down process. It should be a very collaborative process. And if you're getting that next generation input and thoughts on what works for them, it's going to be much more successful. An example is around a family employment policy I'm working on with a family right now, and that this has largely been a top-down process where the older generation is saying, this is what we want to frame out, this is what's important. And I think that's helpful, but it's only half the story. And now what we're trying to do is to get the fourth generation to say, we want to create opportunities for employment in the business, but we also want to make sure that you guys are earning promotions and that you are earning advancements based on your merit. How can we do that? And so instead of doing something that's more prescriptive, top down, that next generation is starting to engage and say, well, here's what we're thinking. Here's what would work for us. And here's something we feel like is fair. So part of engaging that next generation is giving them real responsibility, because that's how people step up and they feel like it's something they can own, whether that's, in this example of family employment policy, or how to be more engaged as an owner. That when that next generation has real responsibility, sometimes including, hey, you guys take this segment of the next family meeting. You have 2 hours, whatever it is, and instead of it just being handed to them, this is what you guys are going to do, that generally doesn't go well. I've seen that next generation say, oh, we've got 2 hours. What do we want to do? They've got real responsibility. They come together. They have an idea. Sometimes they need help developing it. Well, that's fine. But they have a voice. And I think that really, really matters. And we're seeing, like with the family employment policy, we're crafting a much better policy because of their input. And they have a sense of ownership over it. And it's not just something that's happening to them. They're really involved.
Two things that happen when you have that kind of conversation like Josh is having about the next generation having that voice is there are two things that can stop it. Sometimes it's the generation prior that's not ready to give that voice over. But another thing that can happen is that that next generation can say, well, this isn't really ours. They own it. They've made the decisions. They've run it. We don't want to step in where we don't know or unwanted. Or there can be a fear that I don't see things like my cousins see it and the generation prior can see the same thing. But again, everybody needs to be at the table to start doing it differently. And what we do know is with, succession or with any decisions that are going to be made in the future, the next generation has to be engaged and educated in order to do it. So no matter what is making it hard, whether it's coming from the prior generation or from the next generation saying, well, we don't feel ownership of it, we know it needs to happen. So we want to encourage what Josh is saying and to have that generation engage in those roles. No matter what's making it difficult, we can help through that because we know that the next generation is at some point going to be part of this transition, no matter what that transition is. So they will be making decisions.
Perfect. Well, we're going to go to audience Q&A in just a moment. Before we do, I want to remind people that we will have a feedback form that we'd love to see your feedback on it right after the session. Also, we're going to point you to a couple of additional things that you may want to look at to learn more. This article, Josh is a co-author on shared leadership offers growth opportunities for the family and enterprise, and it talks about models for leadership as you move to the second generation and beyond. So a great way of looking at some specific examples of what we've talked about today. And then Jen is a co-author on this article on durable family harmony, on navigating family business dynamics. So some of the things that we've talked about today are very much related to that topic. If you're looking to learn more on the FBCG website, we have complimentary newsletters, webinar recordings of all the programs that we've done in the past, and I think thousands at this point of articles on family business topics. Use the search bar. You'll be able to find some great information on that. And we will go then to Q&A. And actually, we're going to go straight to the information about education that you were just touching on a moment ago. One of the questions was around how do you deal with varying levels of understanding that you see within a family as you go through these processes? How do you educate people, bring people to the same level of understanding, or engage people who may have different levels of awareness or involvement in these different decisions?
It's a good question. At the beginning of this, I used an example of a G3 to G4 transition where there were 3 G3 family members all engaged in different places in the enterprise. And there are, I think, 9 G4 family members. One of those G4 family members runs one of their businesses. 2 of them sit on a board. The others really have very little cognizance of the company, let alone what it means to be an owner. All of them are in the dark about what the owner transition plan is, and there is no real business succession plan yet. So they're very different understandings of everything from, what they've been told about the business to roles in the business to family business in general. A few of them have been to education programs. So the answer to that is we're always dealing with different levels of education. So in any family, we get an idea of who knows what, and then we work to figure out how to level everybody up to where they need to be for the roles they want to play. So there's a certain amount of information we want everybody to know, but somebody who is going to get engaged ultimately in a path to potentially become a successor, we're going to make sure that they have a different type of leadership development moving forward than someone else would. But if there are certain tables, like for example, a family council, there are going to be certain topics that everybody's going to be exposed to. So part of it is an understanding of what people know and what people don't, some individualized attention, and then some is group conversations so that we're really leveling everybody up to what we think any family business owner should understand. And then there's also the question we sometimes get about ages, and that we can talk about it, additionally. So, younger, from a very young age, we can get people engaged in what it means to be responsible financially and to give back and values. So there's all sorts of conversation around education you can engage in depending on what you're talking about. But it's all doable, and education is a huge part of any family figuring out who needs to know what and when and why.
Yeah. One of our participants has shared a pain point that I'd love your perspective on. He reflects that their family has been in governance or in a process of governance since 2019. It seems like they start from scratch, as if each decision is new for the first time when they revisit things. So how do you see families create continuity and to build on the work that they're doing in governance? Or what would you suggest to this person if they're feeling like they're kind of revisiting things over and over again in their family processes?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like an interesting pattern, right? Where you may make progress and then you come back. And I would really be interested in what is going on in the system that brings the pattern back to that same place. What are people's interests, or, what's going on with the power too, that brings it back to that same place instead of being able to advance? So it's like, that's a really interesting process. This may be an opportunity for agreements to be made. Or, okay, the first thing I would say is shine a light on that. And somebody can say, look, this is what I'm noticing and what's happening here, right? There's a curiosity. And people may be able to weigh in on that and say, well, I'm experiencing something different. Or it's like, yeah, you're right. We keep doing this. Why? And you may be able to identify it and then say, okay, how can we do something different? And that when we make agreements, and we've talked a lot about this, everything we're talking about in terms of roles and responsibilities and the decision matrix and fair process, these are agreements. Those agreements are only as good as you bring them into life and action. You can type up a great value statement or a great, behavioral guidelines, whatever it is, but if it goes into a drawer and nobody looks at it, it really doesn't mean that much. So when you make these agreements and when you create a decision matrix, I think it's really vital to bring them into action by referring to them on a really consistent basis. You have your vision statement in front of you. You read it before each meeting. You read your fair process guidelines together. You reaffirm them. And it's that much easier to bring them into action. And so for this question, there might be an opportunity to look at what's happening, understand why, make new agreements. This doesn't have to be pages of agreements. It might be 5 bullet points. And then read them at the beginning of meetings and really make sure you're doing something different together by bringing that agreement into life and action.
I think we've seen people who have their focus or their code of conduct or whatever at the top of every meeting agenda, right? So you can ground yourself and this is how we're going to work together going forward. So that's a great suggestion that you revisit them at future meetings and ensure that you're building on those. That's fantastic. So one last area of question as we come to a close here. The conversation we were having a few minutes ago around trust sparked up a flurry of responses in the questions box around really the theme here is, what if there's a lack of trust? What if there has been breached trust? How do you think about these processes when you're not in a position of having high trust and you want to build that trust perhaps going forward?
And I'll kick this over to Josh after, because I think we'll both have opinions. So very briefly is really just having the conversations, having someone facilitate these conversations, having trust break down in any family business, family enterprise is totally normal at some point. So having someone facilitate the discussion and understand, like in the example that Josh was just pointing to, why, if you started a governance process, why didn't it work? If there were resentments, why do they exist? Help us understand it so we can figure out how to get through the conversation or to create the right guardrails so that we can get beyond this, so that next generations don't have to deal with it moving forward, and acknowledging that prior generations probably didn't create mistrust intentionally. So you do all of that with an open mind, hearing everybody's perspective and with no judgment. So if things exist, we address the things, and having the conversation is the best way to do that. Like I said, conflict in itself is not a problem. Productive conflict is what gets us through it. We don't want to have resentment, so we need to get past it.
I would just add briefly, I think it's little steps, right? You're sort of acknowledging the challenges of the current situation. You can acknowledge what's happened in the past, and say, we don't want to repeat that pattern. This is what we want to do going forward. And you start to build back trust step by step. And those little steps really do start to add up. I think with the families I've worked with where there is low trust, it's one of the more challenging situations to navigate. And it's something where having a neutral advisor and facilitator can really help, because then people's comments aren't seen as having a particular agenda. They're not as, you can attach a lot of times energy to people's comments. So having somebody who's neutral to sort of help build back trust, I think can be really beneficial. But it's challenging. And I want to acknowledge that this is one of the most challenging situations. And I also want to acknowledge, I know there was a lot of questions asked that we weren't able to address specifically. And, we just want to acknowledge with limited time, but there will be opportunities to get those further addressed, because I took a glance at the questions, like there's some really good ones in here. So thanks for that engagement.
Absolutely. And for those of you who fill out the survey and would like to follow up with Josh or Jen directly on any of those items, or would like someone to reach out and follow up on those questions, that is an opportunity that we provide. So stick around, fill out the survey, and we'll follow up with you. So with that, though, we are at time for today for all the great questions and discussion in our allocated hour. Josh, Jen, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your expertise and your perspective with our audience.
Thanks, Christy.
Thanks, Christy. And thanks for everyone who attended and stuck with us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
Hope that we will see you all at a future program.